From a mind change perspective, addiction is something that we do, just like a disease is something that we do. And contrary to popular belief, addicts have a very good reason for doing what they do. Very good reason, just like people who do disease have a very good reason for doing what they do. Welcome back to the Mind Change podcast. I'm your host, Heather McKean. And today joining me is my partner in both life and business, Kent McKean. And we're going to be covering a topic near and dear to my heart, and that's going to be addiction. So welcome.
Great. Thanks for having me again. All right, let's dive into this idea of addiction.
Yes.
So we're talking about addiction for a number of reasons, right? We have episode coming up soon about a guy that's come in, client that's come in. I have many clients who have done addiction in different ways. So this will be helpful in understanding a little bit about what happens in the mind, what's happening in the body during people's picking up of addictions, whatever they might be. But we're going to dive into the science behind it and what's actually happening. So get us started.
Yeah, we have a really different, I think, take on addiction, a different way that we go about working with addiction and handling addiction, which I think in one sense is good. I think we need a different way of handling addiction, a different way of approaching something that I would say for most people, this subject or this topic has touched their life in some way or another.
So tell me then, why is it so important in one sense to have a different approach? Because there are a lot of programs out there. There's a lot of people out there that have gone through program after program, or maybe are in a program right now that they're trying to get help, or maybe their family stuck them in there, or whatever it is. But why is this important in one sense to have a different approach?
Listen, as a society, we are failing in the area of addiction. We've been failing for generations. The addiction models that we have and have had, and they've changed a little bit over time, are just inadequate in really helping people overcome. As a matter of fact, the addiction epidemic, I feel like, is getting worse than ever before. So it's important that we take different approaches, something that actually works to help people overcome addiction. All right, so let's look at some of the facts. From according to the American Addiction Centers, less than 42% of individuals who enter a drug and alcohol treatment facility even complete it.
So you're saying that every other person, more than every other person who enters some sort of rehabilitation, some sort of facility of sorts for help to change, to overcome some addiction, half of them, more than half of them don't even finish, let alone are successful, but just half of them don't even finish.
Don't even finish.
Okay.
So that's the ones that you can actually get into treatment. And over time, is it no wonder that these people don't want to go to treatment? Most of them are using with people who've been in multiple treatment facilities. So it's almost like the addict understands that this kind of Hail Mary that we have as a society doesn't actually even work.
Okay, so then that kind of prompts me to my next question, which is, there's a lot of programs out there, I'd say the majority of programs, that you come through, and even if you finish, the mentality is, well, this will always be a struggle for you. Or, well, you've overcome this, but not really, you're still an addict, you're just not a practicing addict, right? So the whole once an addict, always an addict kind of a thing. Tell me how the mind change approach differs from that mentality entirely.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the segue into that is probably a little bit about how the mind works, which is our preset and our belief system about what it is that we're doing. It almost like creates a confirmation bias. It almost creates the lens in which we filter all of the information that we would engage with at that point. So I remember, so I've got a long history with the idea of rehabilitation and addiction, coming from a long line of people addicted in my family, drugs, alcohol, prescription medications, and also illegal drug use. And I remember that from even my perspective as a child, watching family members go in and out of treatment, realizing even at a very young age, like, wait, something isn't working. Then I heard as my mom finally entered into a treatment facility, gosh, when she was, I think, in her 50s, she mentioned that one of the first things they tell you on like your first day in there is, you know, you're sitting with a group of maybe 10 to 12 people that are going to be in your sort of small group, right? They say only one of you will actually go into recovery. So that already sets you up for the fact that, okay, wow, only one of us is probably going to make it out of this successfully. And knowing the mind of an addict, some of the drivers behind addiction in the first place, rarely is the addict going to be like, oh, wait, that's probably me. I'm probably the one that is good enough, is smart enough, works hard enough, deserves being the one who gets well or recovers.
Yeah, because there's a reason that someone started with the addiction in the first place, right? Let alone just not the actual substance or the thing, but we're talking about the drivers behind what started it anyways.
Right. So kind of moving through a generalized view of the model of addiction is for, I think, generations and generations, decades, this idea of addicts were that they were moral cretins, right? That they were just losers, or they were degenerates, or they were just people not taking responsibility. You know, this is how they ended up being addicts. So that's kind of the way that society treated them for generations. They were outcasts. They were, these people. So then that isn't going to really help anybody. They already feel like that's part of why they use in the first place. So to have an entire system that categorizes them and in one sense confirms what they already felt about themselves, there's very little help for getting well out of that. So over time, we moved into more of this kind of disease-based model. And this is a little bit around 12-step, the AA kind of philosophy, right? That this is a disease. This is something that we likely genetically inherited. And so to some degree, while it's not our fault, it is our responsibility to work within the confines of this disease. The idea being you will always have this. It will always be something that you are engaging with and in one sense, like treating.
Well, it sounds like what you're saying is that even when someone goes into a program, they end up figuring out ways to manage the problem while holding on to the problem, but you're managing it rather than just, well, it's a problem and it gets worse and worse. At least they're trying to manage it. But that doesn't necessarily solve any problems.
Well, to stay in recovery, you have to stay identified as an addict. And so again, when we're talking brain science here, it just doesn't really work.
Now, this is a little bit like a lot of different ailments that we talk about, even chronic health issues, is if someone gets well, oftentimes the community will say, well, then it was never really a chronic issue for you in the first place. Or if someone actually overcomes an addiction, well, you must have not had the disease or the genetic makeup for, or the whatever, you just had some problems, but you were never really addicted, right? That's kind of the mentality, right?
Yeah, I think to some degree, I will say, at least in my experience, I rarely ever met anyone or even heard of anyone that felt like they had beat addiction, that it was something that they would no longer ever struggle with. Moreover, it was the people that were one day at a time, the white knuckling it, the constant need for sponsorship and support and following, a checklist of things to not be the one that just falls off the wagon.
And when you fall off the wagon, there's guilt and there's shame and there's all these things that have to happen, which then creates the cycle again, right?
Right. Now, I do want to say, listen, I don't want to take away from the success and the support that a lot of people have found in the 12-step program and in AA. I know within my family, we did, multiple generations of AA. I was in Alateen. I did Al-Anon. These were all the things that I was involved in growing up because addiction was such a prevalent part of my story.
And would you, with all of the Alla whatevers, wouldn't you say that, or I don't know, this is more a question for you, is what was most helpful? Was it the steps? Was it the things? Was it the community? Was it the support? Like, what is it that is so helpful in those? Because there are things that are helpful in it. Well,
I think it's like many things. It's like many of the support groups I did within the illness communities of the various illnesses that I did. It's so that you don't feel like you're alone. You don't feel like you're crazy. You don't feel like you're the only one dealing with this, because if you do, it's easy to make beliefs around yourself.
Which, we'll probably get into this a little later, but the whole beliefs about being the only one or being the problem or whatever, oftentimes is the reason people will continue to escape, right? Because they don't want to deal with the reality of whatever's going on inside.
Yes. So the issue with this disease model is that it stays within a model of thinking that we actually, through mind change, don't really adhere to in general, which is that something that's happening outside of us can make something happen inside of us, right? Or that a disease is something that happened to us that we just somehow picked up along the way and now are destined to deal with for the rest of our lives. From a mind change perspective, addiction is something that we do, just like a disease is something that we do. And contrary to popular belief, addicts have a very good reason for doing what they do. Very good reason, just like people who do disease have a very good reason for doing what they do. The disease model, I get the appeal of it because it takes away some of the blame and some of the shame and some of the feeling of, if there is something I can do about this, why am I not doing something about this? It sort of helps. It helps the people who are addicts. It helps people who are the family of addicts to kind of stop looking for fault or blame and be able to just all stick it into this label of disease.
Okay.
So the problem with that we've already talked about, though, is that it doesn't actually provide a lot of help to getting well.
Okay, so community in and of itself, support, community, very important in and of itself. But if that community, this is what I'm hearing, if that community keeps us as an addict or as family in this victim mentality, in this, I'm just going to have this problem forever, or at least other people have this problem too, that's not going to help us get out of the problem. So having a community surrounding us that maybe is, what's the word? I mean, perhaps enabling us to continue in that pattern of thinking?
Sure. I mean, enabling is a great way to put it because it's very common in the addiction speak, in the realm of that codependency, enabling. That's a lot of what you're going to hear in addiction circles.
Right.
But I would say we need to sort of take one big giant step back, because it's easy to get involved in all of that stuff when you're in the midst of it. Mm-hmm. But unless we take a wider, more meta perspective of addiction in the first place, then we can sometimes be using this language and be saying these things as a way to seem like we're helping. but it really just kind of keeps the problem going, just feeds into it.
Okay.
So I know that for me, one of the people that I have really learned so much from and really respect and admire is Gabor Mate. And he is what I feel like is one of the foremost authorities on addiction, but also trauma in our modern world. And I'd love to read a quote that he says when he's speaking about addiction. He's the author of a book called In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. And through that book, he really talks about, as a trained medical doctor, how his approach to addiction really shifted and changed when he was in the streets and when he was with what we would call maybe like the worst of the worst population when we deal with addiction, right?
Okay. Yeah.
So something that he says is addiction is not a choice anybody makes. It's not a moral failure or an ethical lapse. It's not a weakness of character. It's not a failure of will, which is how our society usually depicts addiction. Nor is it an inherited brain disease, which is how the medical tendency is to see it. But what it actually is a response to human suffering. Or rather than being a disease or choice, it's an attempt to escape suffering. And he goes on to explain that the training within medical professionals is that the average medical student until very recently has never heard the word trauma in relation to their education. It doesn't show up. We don't talk about it. This is Gabor Mate saying this. We don't talk about its impact on the brain or on the personality or on the emotional life of people, or that it has an impact on people's physical health. It's just not a word that they mention. He says they're trauma-phobic, as a fellow doctor said. The medical profession is trauma-phobic. And psychiatrists these days are trained in more of a biological model of psychiatry, where everything comes down to a biological brain disease. And the answer to that is, here, let's give you a pill, right? So drugs to treat the addiction to drugs, which I think right there within that message, we've got something wrong. There's something fundamentally wrong with that. So Gabor Mate goes on to say that the last thing that most psychiatrists know how to talk about is actually emotional pain or its origins in human experience. You'd think they know how to do that, but they don't. They're not trained in it. It's not part of the dominant medical ideology. And I love his take on all of this. So basically what he says is addiction is the result of trauma. Now, not everybody who has trauma will go into addiction.
Sure.
But it's very common. It's one of the very, very common coping mechanisms. And so even if someone isn't going into addiction of an illicit drug or alcohol, there's addiction to porn, there's addiction to shopping, there's addiction to devices, and there's addiction to work.
Well, and there's addiction to failure. There's addiction to, doing things that keep hurting you emotionally. There's addiction to different relationships. I mean, there's addiction to anything, right? We do it to, as he said, what? Escape.
Right. There's addiction to self-help.
Mm-hmm.
Many people are jumping from one modality to another modality, to retreat after thing after thing, in search of this elusive, like, perfection or wellness or
happiness,
thing that they think that they don't have. And so that explains so much more.
Can I ask you a question then?
Of course.
You just said chasing something that they think they don't have. And so from a mind change perspective, if we're not looking to the outside to give us something that we're wanting, something that we feel like we need, then what I'm hearing you say is that we need to go within rather than outside. If I do this, if I change this, if I have this, if I cope in this way, outside, and go within and find, okay, what am I missing? And then fill ourselves from within. Yes?
Yes. This is the paradox, if you will, of getting well or healing from addiction, because addicts typically are using to quell a deep internal suffering. And very often it comes from the way they feel about themselves. And this, we're talking like base level core belief systems. So at their core, the way they feel about themselves is really very poorly, very low. And they then, of course, begin to use, they act out in various ways. They hurt the people closest to them. They make choices and decisions they would never make if they're in their right mind. And all of these things just begin supporting the way that they feel is true about themselves. Already. So it's just, again, it's like a bit of a confirmation bias. And so when we are dealing with addicts and we're saying, okay, the way out of this is to go in, that's the very reason they use in the first place, is to not feel, is to numb out, or in some senses to feel something other than pain, something other than numbness, something other than just agony or disconnection.
Now, there's a lot of people that would easily identify, oh, this person doesn't want to deal with this, and then they're numbing out. But I would say the majority of people, at least people we've seen and people we've come into contact with, wouldn't necessarily overtly like, oh, I'm escaping this, therefore, right? It's mostly, for most people, a complete subconscious program that's going on.
Right. It's become the norm for them. This idea of the way they feel about themselves, and they're not spoken things. As children, we don't often go around speaking out like, I don't think I'm worthy of love. I don't feel good enough. I feel like, a moral failure. As
adults, we also do not typically do that.
No, right? So these children are carrying these belief systems. And this is why this idea that addiction is genetic. Because very often when you are a child of an addict and you're raised in a home or a situation where you are, as a child, what you feel like is competing for love, for attention, for validation, you feel like you're competing with a substance. And what that does, this was my story, I very much felt like I was waiting for my mom to choose me over drugs or over alcohol. I would not have been able to say that as a child. I didn't know this until way deep into my recovery process of my own healing. But that's the way I felt as a child. And so every time she used or binged or disappeared or, the various things that happen in the home of an addict, I blamed myself. I internalized that.
And so as children, if we're going to sum that up, as children, we might carry the problems. And then as adults, we end up burying the problems.
Sure. And using oftentimes some of the same coping mechanisms we witnessed in our parents. It's so common to hear children of addicts vehemently say, I will never use, I've seen the damage that it does, and then end up right in that same, right in the same kind of thing. Or they use a different substance.
Right.
But they're still in complete and total addiction to something. So for me, a lot of things that I was dealing with was the neglect, the perceived neglect, and this competition of feeling like I was, competing for love. I was really just wanting to be worthy of love and really feeling like that needed to come from especially my mother. So did I get involved? I did end up getting, sort of recreationally involved in a little bit of drugs and alcohol here, but always with this mindset that I would never go as deep as they did, right? But what ended up happening, and I've shared this before, is I became addicted to chronic disease without realizing it. And with, collecting all these different things, to the same fact that when I had young children, here I was so sick, so disabled, so unable to give them at the time what they needed.
Well, and let's also use that word, completely medicated.
Sure.
Right now, it was a different kind of way of medicating, but it was medicating.
Yeah, I mean, if we're going to apples to apples here, I was on way more drugs. way more drugs than my parents ever got a hold of, right? So I still did it. I did it differently. And in a way that, had you told me that at the time, that I was a drug addict, I would have, with very little energy, probably tried to punch you in the face. But, you know, that really ended up being the same thing.
Right.
Why? Because it was inherited, because it was genetic. No, it was the thing that's getting passed down and passed down and passed down is the trauma.
Right.
Is the feelings of not good enough, is the shame, is the guilt, is the worthlessness.
And so when we're talking about, if we can kind of segue into what's happening in the brain, right? So this idea of trauma happens, perceived trauma, it doesn't matter, big T, little t, there's trauma. And then our brain and our body end up linking, right? Linking something, which ends up becoming a coping skill, which ends up becoming the subconscious program of something happens, something triggers, and we just, boom, go straight into that addiction, that whatever, that coping skill. So tell me a little bit about what's happening in the brain.
So I love this little bit of reframe about this, because I think it's something Gabor Mate talks about, but that we often think of addiction as this like cheap way out, right? Like it's a unhealthy escape, where rather this is someone's attempt to do something about the way they feel. There's agency in this. They don't want to feel the way they feel.
So even though they may, on a conscious level or on a like outward looking at the person level, looks like they're numbing out, but on a subconscious level, on a deeper level, they're actually trying to do something.
Yes, they're trying to make a choice, a decision. They are doing something. And what they're trying to do is to quiet the pain, because they've probably tried other ways. And, you know, we would like to look in sort of as a judgment and be like, come on, there's got to be, go to therapy, do this, do this. But if we really look at a lot of these things that we might tell someone to do, where do we see the victories?
Well, listen, we can judge all we want of like someone that's on the street doing meth versus a parent who, so let's say that there's that parent, they're a parent, they're on meth, they're away from their kids, whatever, versus the parent who is addicted to work or addicted to whatever, a device or something, and not present with their kids but they're around. Like, which is doing more damage? The one that's not around and on drugs, or the one who is around but never present, right? I mean, it's...
Ooh, that's going to be triggering for some people out there. Hold on to your hats. The thing is that trauma is perceived by the body of the child. And so neglect is neglect.
Right.
Whether it's happening through drugs or whether it's happening through the choice of someone spending more time at work. Now, we will want to really fight against that and say, no, it's way worse. It's way worse with meth and all of that stuff.
And there might be more, like, I don't know what you want to call it, better, maybe healthier coping skills in one sense.
Sure.
But there's still coping skills, and the stuff that's going underneath, the subconscious programs, they're still firing up in the brain and body. And
right.
We are still escaping, and we are still trying to get away, and we are still trying to heal whatever's buried underneath that we ended up carrying.
Yeah, and so back to what you had mentioned with the way the brain works is if you've got someone who is in an enormous amount of internal pain and they don't know where to go, who to turn to, how to deal with this, and they try a substance. Mm-hmm. And that substance alters their brain chemistry, and for a moment, they don't feel the pain. What that does is creates an incredible link, an incredible bond, where there's already a missing space of support, connection, love. Then the drug becomes, in one sense, the parent. It becomes the friend. It becomes the relief. It becomes the thing that can finally be counted on, that's reliable, that's for this person. And so we have a very interesting relationship with substances. They are more than just the drug. They are, I've worked with many, many addicts, and if you really get in, and if you can come in without the judgment, and you're really curious, and you start to dig underneath of this stuff, you hear the virtual love that these people have when they speak of the substance. The projection that they have put on the substance is what they were really missing in their home life in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Or, deep within. And those people who maybe have not experienced this, I think that can be really hard to understand. But there's this quote by a gentleman named Johann Hari. He's the TED Talk author of something called Everything You Think You Know About Addiction Is Wrong. And I love this quote. He says, is the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. That is what's missing. And what's happening is that the addict is connected, but they're connected to the substance. And what they're lacking is connection to healthy, safe people and environments.
But isn't this the same thing? Let's, for just a moment, take away this idea of linking to a substance. Because we're talking about addiction. Now, most people, when you think about addiction, of course, they're thinking about drugs, they're thinking about alcohol, they're thinking about cigarettes, they're thinking about whatever. But for just a moment, take the substance out. How else does the brain and body link to things that are trying to get something that they needed? For instance, with work, with achievements, with devices, with anything that maybe isn't a substance.
Well, it's just the linking process that our brain does. We're meaning-making machines. And so when we get the perceived thing that we want, even if it's synthetic, and almost especially if it's synthetic, you earn your worth or your value through a work achievement, let's say, or porn addiction is especially interesting because it's actually not about sex. It's really not about sex. It is also about connection.
You're telling me, and for those of you who are listening and not watching, I have a very facetious face. You're telling me that pornography is not actually, porn addiction is not actually about sex. So sex addiction and sex.
No, it's also about connection. And I mean, that sounds crazy for someone who doesn't understand that. But again, there's the reliability of it. There's the ability to have it in a moment's notice. There's the ability of putting yourself in the place of whomever you're putting yourself in the place of, in the story and the fantasy of porn, and getting the thing that you think you want out of that.
So do you mind for a moment? I've worked with a number of men doing porn addiction and gone through a lot of different things. Can I share some things about some clients?
Yes.
So goodness, I remember there was this one client, I'll share about a few of them and just some different similarities, but one client who, like you said, was in, I think it was SA, right? Like Sex Anon or whatever it is, and had been doing that for years and years, had been, before doing that, very covert, right? Like no one knew there was an issue, and it was constant pornography, constant all of this other stuff. And then, was married and did all these things, and then things got exposed, basically, and then went into Sex Anon, went into therapy, went into counseling, went into like church groups, went into all these different things. And even very, very, I'll say a lot of accountability, very constrictive in one sense, to help the person, this guy, no longer quote unquote struggle or do these things. Now, again, in the act out, that's what I was going to say. This is the terminology that people use with most drugs or even sex things. It's acting out, right? Instead of just saying what you did. It's interesting. But so to help this person not act out, he was involved in all these different programs and all these things, but it was still happening. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't as, it was a little more periodic, right? Because there was accountability, there was a lot of shame, there was a lot of like, is my wife going to trust me? There's a lot of stuff there. So we get to working, and one of the first questions during the consult is like, what should I do? My whole week is filled with this on this night and this on this day and this on, and now I'm going to add you. I don't know if I have extra time, Kent, to work with you. I said, listen, you can do whatever you want, but this is your choice. What the person ended up doing was saying, because he asked a lot of questions about how this is going to help and how this is going to work. And after talking, he realized, wow, everything that I'm trying to get from the support groups, from the accountability, from the counseling, from all these different things, what if I can get all of that in one place and have it start changing quickly? So he said, I'm just going to put a break on all those things. And then he worked with me. We did 5 sessions. And man, after a 2 or 3 sessions, it was just, I was poking, right? Just, okay, here it is. There's the computer. There's the girl. There's the videos. There's the pictures, really trying. And there was nothing left. Now, the thing that needed to be delinked, if we're talking about this whole idea of linking, is mostly it was connection. Mm-hmm. Connection with mom or lack thereof, connection with himself, a lot of worth issues. And then the things that he got from this it was never, like you said, it was never about sex. It was about feeling wanted, feeling worthy, feeling needed, feeling close, intimacy, all of these things that he desperately wanted that he just never learned how to have other than through these synthetic pictures, videos, sexual images, whatever else, right? And it was all just there. And then boom, gone. Everything's been changed in his life ever since. Another, number of clients, very similar things. It has so much to do with trauma, something that happened younger. And yes, there's the first experience of pornography. There's the first interaction with it. But ultimately, it has to do with what did that mean to that child, that teenager, that young adult when they first encountered it, and what was already missing. Right. And then once you match those, once you take those and you delink the sex, the porn, the whatever, you take that out, and then you allow their brain and body to have what they needed in the first place: connection, love, understanding, acceptance, wantedness, desired, all of that through other relationships, through healthy things. Then they can let go of that thing that's synthetic because they recognize it's no longer there on a biological and neurochemical level. It doesn't give them what they need anymore. In fact, because it doesn't give them what they need, they don't want it.
Right. That's the difference. There's no compulsion. That's when you know something has been healed. You heal the compulsion. You heal that, the thing that is the driver toward it. I remember working in multiple, through some of my earlier training, I worked at a drug and rehab facility on Oahu. And I remember getting into we'd get into some of these people had been using meth since they were like 6 years old. We've got layer upon layer upon layer of experiences with addiction and the various things that they've done at this point, right? And so something that even within the community of the employees that worked there, right, who were former addicts, recovering addicts themselves, was they all still talked about how the compulsion to use was alive and well. The compulsion to use. And that's what we would go after and work on and ended up even needing to work on the staff so that they could see that there was actual true freedom.
Because it's not about just not falling off the wagon or acting out or what. It's not about not doing those things.
Right. If you have to white knuckle it for the rest of your life, then the whole idea there, and remember, the brain is a meaning-making machine. So much of this stuff is metaphoric, and the way we represent something in our mind is going to have a profound impact on what happens in our life. If we're just one step away from using again, if we're just one stressful thing from, picking up the pipe or, shooting up again or whatever that is, picking up the bottle, then that's always the option in our mind. And if you talk to people who are not addicts, it is not an option to pick up a needle and to shoot up. That's not an option when things get hard.
They may have different options that they're using.
Right. They may have different coping mechanisms, right? And so that's the stuff that has to be unlayered and uncovered. And so, there's, so few, I don't know any other programs out there that are seeing success in stuff like, well, definitely drug and alcohol addiction, but pornography as well. Still, it is this idea of coping around your coping mechanism.
Well, and even there is a biological addiction to anger.
Sure.
I mean, there's anger management and all of these different things out there. But again, it's just managing things versus you can actually, being angry and getting angry, we get dopamine hits. I mean, it's like something that actually happens biologically. We create it through trauma, through unsafety, through whatever. Something comes up, all of a sudden we neurobiologically feel good or feel better for the moment when we, right? And then we learn how to, in one sense, be addicted to anger, right? So it's all of these different things. So then segue for a moment and tell me what we've talked about: the substance, the linking, the delinking, all these things. What about secondary gains when it comes to addiction, right? Because we can get into the mind and delink however they started doing what they were doing, right? Take that away. They don't want that anymore. Great. Now we're putting it into something good. But then what about those who maybe have some very good secondary gains to hold on to these? And maybe you can explain secondary gains for those who don't understand.
Right. I know we've talked about secondary gains before, but what they are is they're really subconscious pluses, that we get from the problem that we're doing, that we say we want to get rid of, but actually it's serving us in some way. So with addiction, it's pretty easy. The secondary gains is not feeling the pain. So they feel like if I let go of the addiction, then I'm going to have to come full force into the pain that I've been avoiding this whole time anyway.
Stuff they feel about themselves, things they feel about life, regret, shame, whatever's there.
The horrible, horrific things that happened to them in childhood.
Or things that they've done.
Sure, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
That is so scary. In fact, too scary for most.
And
I would
so
say this is the story
it?
with my mom, who had, through even some of this work, had some major success with alcohol, but then the pills.
Success letting go of alcohol.
Success letting go of the alcohol, which had been there for 50 plus years, even through rehab and stuff like that. But when it came to undoing the link around the pills and everything like that, that's where we hit some walls of the things that had to be faced that, and it wouldn't have been, anyone who's done this work knows we do huge major issues, and it doesn't have to be like we get in, we talk about it, we have to rehash and refeel and go. We don't do that. We don't have to do that. We've got wonderful little ways of getting into that stuff through the subconscious mind where you feel it like this and then you let go of it, right? But it's that fear of facing it, the overwhelm of it, that drives the addiction in the first place. Mm-hmm. So the secondary gains of using are oftentimes that, okay, well, what am I going to have if I don't have this? So that's, the work we do is making sure we're not just removing a coping mechanism, we're putting in, we don't put in because it's really just uncovering, because a lot of the stuff is there already, right? Just because a parent neglected does not mean the child was not worthy of love. Like that's just there. The child is worthy of love and is this amazing creation in spite of the fact that their parent was unable at the time to give and show it that way, right?
Well, and when we work with clients, once we take off these perceived, or we always call them perceived, whether it's very true, little true, all the way true, they're still perceived. It's the way but once you take away those perceived negative interactions, traumas, whatever, especially about worth and all of that, what ends up happening with every single client is, like you said, what gets uncovered is inherent worth. And all the ways that they actually didn't notice before that now they notice, they were actually looked after, they were seen, they were heard in all of these other ways that couldn't have been perceived before.
Yeah, it's some of my favorite work to do is working with someone who has been ravaged, by this addiction, who has these beliefs around they will never not feel that compulsion, right, to use, to clean up all this stuff, to do all this work, and then have them be horrified. You can see it in their body, like their words, their whole persona is horrified by the thought of using a substance again, of shooting up, of smoking, of whatever it is. They're just horrified by it because now they are in touch with what they were looking for the whole time.
Which is already in there.
Yeah, it's already in there. And I know that that can feel really hard to believe for an addict, but it's there. And we have luckily, so much great experience with that, with people overcoming all sorts of addictions, even the most hardcore, kind of things. But I this is something that I feel really passionate about because there is hope. There are answers. We can and need to do better with this. The rehab model out there is just broken. And I can say that from having participated in it with family members for many, many years. But I actually worked in a drug and alcohol rehab center in Southern California. So very much behind the scenes, got to see, it was a very, at the time it was $30,000 for a 30-day stay. And this was 20 years ago, right? So particular hotspot for celebrities and, musicians to come. And the fact of the matter was from behind the scenes, inside they could get better drugs easier than they got on the outside. They were really just being pampered and, taking a little break away from doing their addiction in a more, public eye. So I saw it from that perspective, even speaking with some of the, the staff and the doctors, hearing the conversations behind the scenes. It's just it's a hopeless regime out there. They just don't see a lot of success. And whether they're willing to finally admit that to themselves or not, I mean, listen, I get why that would be hard. If this is your career, this is what you've dedicated your life to.
Well, and I would say the majority of people in that field, whether it's volunteering because you've gone through things, whether it's you're a doctor, whether you're a therapist, whatever, there is a deep heart to help people.
Oh, sure. Yes.
It's just that
they want to help.
The tools aren't there.
Right. Over time, then they get jaded. And
sure.
It's just medical community, the therapy community. We're seeing a lot of this now. Even the National Institute on Drug Abuse says 85% of individuals who enter treatment relapse within a year of treatment. So we've got half people don't even make it through treatment. And of the half that does just complete the treatment, 85% of those people will relapse. Now, that's the people who admit to the relapsing.
So what you're saying is out of 100 people, let's just say, 45 of them will complete it. The rest of the 55 are just gone. 45 will complete. 85% of that, which is about, let's say, 35 people, will relapse within, a year. And that's just who admit it. So
within a year.
So and then the rest, who knows, right?
Right.
And we don't even know what happens to the others.
Well, and again, most people in the addiction community will say these numbers are relatively inflated because it's all, in relation to reporting and to people who are willing to report back, right? So the numbers are far more dismal. But let's just, on a more hopeful side, well, those people usually will go into the AA program, right? So they will be attending meetings and they will be doing all of that. And again, not here to say anything negative about AA. I know it's helped a lot of people.
Sure.
But again, it's still that white knuckling approach. And I would prefer myself and for anyone else who I love, to not have to white knuckle it every day to thrive.
Yeah.
And something else was super interesting is I, of course, read a lot about this kind of stuff, feel very passionate about this stuff. And I came across this article from a woman who I think she did some stuff. I don't know a ton about her history, but I think she was involved in the addiction community herself, maybe coming through, and then went into therapy of some sort. Like that was her career in helping, I think, rehab counseling and everything like that. Her name is Kristen Harlow. And she is the author of an article called are the 12 steps safe for trauma survivors? And I thought this was very interesting because if we can accept that the powers that be, the smartest people out there right now in this field, are connecting the fact that 100% of people who go into addiction, who are substance abuse users, right, or substance abusers, have a traumatic background, have some sort of trauma in their background, then we have to see that the 12-step program, the AA model, is really still, after all these years, still the predominant resource for these people to go into once they complete maybe their stint at a facility, right? Or sometimes because they're free and accessible, and almost anywhere you go in the world, you can find a meeting happening, right? So I really appreciated this take on it, and I'm going to read some of this from her because I do think it's worth us thinking about and looking into. Again, not to vilify the 12-step program, but to say we still need to do better. Let's do better. There's ways to do better than this. And if you know an addict, you're a family member of an addict, if you yourself have struggled with addiction, I hope that this somehow speaks to you that, like, oh, okay, there's hope. There's maybe a reason why I still feel so locked into these behaviors.
Right.
Or I still feel so hopeless or helpless. So this is what she says. She says there are 2 sets of steps in 12-step programs that involve memory recall and direct involvement with others. And that's steps 4, steps 5, steps 8, and steps 9. And she points out that step 4 says, made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. So I'm just going to pause right there. If we understand that addiction is based very strongly in feelings of worthlessness, feelings of disconnect, feelings of outcast from society, unlovable, unworthy, right? Not valued. And one of the primary steps in staying in recovery is to make this, in one sense, fearless moral inventory, right? Or list of all the ways we are these bad people. Now, I don't think it probably says that to make us that we're bad people, but that's the framework in which an addict has. That's the lenses in which they are living their life. Otherwise, they wouldn't be using. You don't get someone who's like, I'm amazing, I'm so valuable, I'm so worthy, I'm a wonderful contributing member to society, and I shoot up every day. We just don't see that happening, right? So I will just say right there, what's happening is we're reinforcing the reason people use in the first place. The step that follows that is step 5, and that's admitting to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. Okay, so now we have the judgment of the people around us. We have our own self-judgment. And now we're involving the
God, source, source
universal,
of life. Like,
the end-all, be-all of our wrongness. Whew, it gets pretty intense. Okay, so I'm just, again, not saying I get where they're going with this. And if this was just a choice, a moral, a moral infraction, if you will.
Or if you could just consciously like, oh, that makes sense why I'm doing that. Okay, I'm not going to do that anymore. Then sure, all of this would be great.
Yes, if this is simply about taking personal responsibility for the bad things that you've done, then yes, I get this. But through a lens of trauma, which again, we know is really 100% of addicts,
Well, and all of us, we are all looking and living life through a lens, whatever that lens is.
Yeah, and even if this didn't happen, like, so oftentimes things skip generations. This is kind of known in the addiction communities and stuff, is that sometimes things skip, we'll say, skipped a generation, and now you've got, my parents were addicts, and I'm not an addict, but my kids become addicts, right? And all we're seeing is just varying coping mechanisms. So collectively, why are we seeing such a huge increase in addiction? Is, well, first of all, the drug companies are making it far more easy to get a hold of this stuff. But beyond that, we've got a collective trauma where we've been so poorly dealing with this stuff that we're pretty much all seeing it through this kind of a wounded lens, right? Okay, back to this. Later, step 8 says, make a list of persons we have harmed and become willing to make amends to them all. Okay, so to deal with that list, step 9 directs people, make direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so may injure them or others. Okay, so you've got to make this list of all the people that you've hurt and that you need to make amends to. And what I would say from a trauma-informed perspective is, who's neglected in this is the little child, the inner you in the first place, that was wounded to begin with. And again, now this child, what we're doing is, instead of going in and healing that child and hearing that child and helping that child, the inner us, which we all have, it's not woo-woo inner child stuff. It's like, we have that part of our brain still alive, which still then influences us and our body and the way that we think.
It's a building block. I mean, as a child, we created an input, memory, and sensations and beliefs, and then it is a building block to every other part of us throughout our life.
Yes. So now, once again, we are denying, neglecting, and abandoning that child to go and focus our love and our making amends to and stuff like that to those people that we've hurt. Now, I am not saying that addicts shouldn't at some point, go back and take some responsibility. I think that there can be a lot of healing in that.
Sure, but by skipping over that process of taking care of you, you're in one sense re-emerging into the problem that began in the first place, where you didn't get to have or get what you perceived as needed.
Yep.
So now you didn't get that as a child or as a young adult or as whatever. And then you did all this hurt because of that, right? Because of the programs. And now you're saying, okay, now I need to deal with the hurt. You're walking into it backwards,
yes,
rather than walking into it from the beginning and dealing with all of that neurochemistry, neurobiology first, then being able to have a different outcome, behavior, process, different lens, because you've already healed you.
Right. It just reinforces, okay, so the problem is me. I am the problem. And that's what got them to use in the first place. So again, I don't want to vilify the process without looking at it from the big narrative, right? And so, that's the thing is, you've got to make this list of all the people you've hurt. Then it's telling you to go and make amends with these people, but without first giving you the skills on how to be loving to yourself, how to be forgiving to yourself, how to learn healthy boundaries, and without all of these things that got you into these situations in the first place. And now you're supposed to go and interact with these people that you hurt, who, listen, are probably hurt. You probably did a lot of things that were very hurtful as you acted out in these ways. But how are you going to deal with that?
Well, and if you're stepping in, apologizing, or whatever you want to call it, making amends with the same you, then you may just be throwing fire on, or throwing gasoline on the fire already, if that makes sense.
And this is why a lot of people don't make it through the steps. They keep going back and repeating 1, 2, and 3, and and everything like that, because these are not set up to be done in a healthy way for people who've experienced trauma. So this author goes on to say the gist of these steps is that they look beyond, or they look at both the resentment and the anger that the person feels towards others, which always involves taking responsibility for part or all of the event that caused the resentment and anger, and also the harms the person caused others. But there's no direct guidance on how to ensure a realistic and safe assessment of the past events. The AA book presents this step as if someone with a substance use disorder has the tendency to blame others. But people with childhood trauma are racked already with self-blame. And it's the self-blame and the shame that fuels many people's addictions in the first place.
And then blaming others as a defense mechanism.
Yes, that's where it comes from.
We think that, oh, these people are just blaming us, blaming this, blaming these situations. But really, when we're blaming, it's because deep down we're already blaming ourselves.
It's projection on the way that they already feel about themselves. And then that's going to cause them to want to use more to get rid of the feelings of extreme shame and guilt. And this step is just fueling that. And there's nothing saying that these people aren't going to just dump onto you more reasons to feel worthless and invaluable and less valuable and unworthy and all of these different things, right? So yeah, this also gets a little bit more sticky because shame is a common feeling, I'd say, a absolute in anybody who's been sexually assaulted. And trauma survivors have to first, in the healing process, restore a positive sense of self, right? They have to reconnect to self. They have to be able to associate in and feel safe and feel loved within self first as part of the healing process. Okay, so in this idea around sexual trauma, obviously being what we would call a big T trauma, it is super prevalent in addicts to have sexual trauma. And again, as we're talking about, some of the issues around the AA model, as the thing that people are doing to stay within recovery, then I want to talk about within the primary text of the Alcoholics Anonymous, which they call the Big Book. It suggests that alcoholics or users review their past sexual life when creating their life inventory in step 4. And for the overall inventory, the book suggests that the reader completely disregard the wrongs others had done and only look at your own mistakes. So even in situations where a person caused harm to the reader should disregard the other person involved entirely and find where we are to blame. So these suggestions can be dangerous for survivors of intimate partner violence or child abuse, sexual abuse, who have been told that they're to blame for the abuse that they suffered. And the book further details what to ask yourself when making an inventory of your sexual conduct. And it says, quote, "Where had we been selfish, dishonest, or inconsiderate? Whom had we hurt? Did we unjustifiably arouse jealousy, suspicion, or bitterness? Where were we at fault? What should we have done instead?" And it's worrisome that in a sex inventory, we should be talking about how we acted selfishly when 1/3 of women and 1/6 of men have been sexually assaulted or raped. And an estimated half of women who experience a sexual assault will end up developing PTSD. And one study found that 80% of women with a substance abuse disorder who seek inpatient treatment have been physically or sexually assaulted. And nearly 70% of men have experienced either physical or sexual abuse. So this is just one of the other ways that I wanted to illustrate how, which is our sort of most widely accepted system, which is AA, of, keeping people in recovery, can actually be reinforcing some of the very root causes why people use in the first place: the blame, the guilt, and the shame. And so, again, not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but just wanting to say that the system that we currently have is just not working.
And so what I'm hearing you say with all of that is that it's saying disregard your own discomforts, problems, issues, and just focus on what the problems that you're creating, rather than recognizing the problems that I'm creating is because of the problems I hold within because of what's happened in my life, and I need to heal that first.
Well, in sexual abuse, one of the major things that ends up needing to be healed is this idea that the victim was somehow to blame. Whether they didn't speak up or they didn't fight back or they enjoyed, physically had some enjoyment of it, even in childhood sexual abuse, this is some of the very things that people are trying to avoid and trying to numb and trying to disconnect from and dissociate from.
And what would be the reason behind that?
The reason behind
this idea of the 12 steps, what it's telling you to do? What would be the reason behind
what the AA book is asking them to do? Well, it's coming from this idea that it's a moral discrepancy
rather than
trauma informed, right? So if this is just a moral discrepancy, then you should be taking some personal responsibility. And you probably have done a lot of things sexually that harmed yourself or others, because of course your substances often, take us away from our judgment, our proper judgment, and we would do things on substances that we normally wouldn't do. And obviously some of the inhibition that we would normally have or be connected to is gone under the substance use. So it's very common for there to be massive sexual traumas that are either perpetrated by an abuser or on someone who is abusing drugs because of all of that. And so I get where they're coming from with it. But if we come from a lens of these people already being traumatized, having to look at what they've done through a lens of see what a bad person you are and how much you've hurt people, that they already think that. That's why they use in the first place. They already believe that. Strengthening that, rehashing that is not going to help.
Because if it just becomes a conscious, behavioral change, a conscious awareness of what I've done and how it's been bad, versus the drivers behind how someone created an addiction in their mind and body in the first place.
Right. And again, we're not throwing this stuff out because I know in my healing process, I've been able to go back and apologize for things, and because it's coming from a place of oh my goodness, had I understood my worth, my value, how connected I was, this would have never happened. And I can see and hold someone else's hurt and pain without personalizing it onto me. So actually that allows me to even be a better source for them. I can't ask for people's forgiveness if I won't forgive myself.
So in other words, instead of just you going out and apologizing or making amends because you're supposed to, and you're supposed to recognize the bad that you've done, you're coming from a healed place of love, worth, and then you can enter into someone else's presence in a completely different manner, taking responsibility out of love, not out of force or have to or should.
Well, there's also some power exchange there that's not very healthy. If I can't be forgiven until I've made amends with this person, or until it's just reinforces this seeking for validation and, from another person. It's giving other people power. And that is, again, very often some of the very reasons people use in the first place is because the people that had the power when they were young misused it. And so, the people have a very unhealthy relationship with power. So I just think it's one of those things that just perpetuates the problem.
So if someone has been through some sort of trauma, sexual assault, other trauma, whatever, it doesn't matter what it is. If someone's been through trauma, which all of us have, the first step to healing, to getting out of addiction, to getting out of coping skills, is to heal us, heal within, heal the issue, heal the trauma first. Then there's other things that, that can be done.
We have to heal the primary wounds. This stuff, otherwise you're just band-aiding, you're just putting coping mechanisms, you're just managing, which is the addiction model and the physical health model as well, the disease model in and of itself, right? It's just you're covering things over, you're managing the symptoms of the thing without dealing with it.
So, okay, so then we've talked about how our brains and bodies link trauma and addiction and substances and whatever else, right? We've talked about the secondary gains on like why someone ultimately on a subconscious level wouldn't let go of an addiction, because this is what's actually keeping them safe, right? Whatever that means to them. What about those? I'm really curious about this because, I think a good question is, does this mean that with mind change, with what we do and how we go after things, and you'll always 100% across the board, everyone can just go from being an addict to not being an addict? What about those who, for some reason, want to continue and enjoy the addiction, the substance, the drugs, the drinking, the pornography, the work, the devices, the whatever?
Right. So do I think anyone can heal? I do. I do think anyone can heal from nearly anything, right? If they're out of alignment with their most optimal functioning self, I do think that people can heal. So addiction's tricky. It doesn't have to be. We've dealt with people who come in and within a couple sessions, something eradicates, right?
Sure.
Even if it's something they've been dealing with and struggling with for a long time. But I also have had numerous people come in with multiple addictions where they're willing to let one or two go because maybe they've dumped all of the vilification onto one or two. This one's bad. Or this one I'm okay with, right? So let's say you got someone coming in and they're an alcoholic and they also smoke cigarettes. And they do not want to stop smoking cigarettes, but they do want to stop being an alcoholic. So that's interesting. And from a unconditional positive regard as a practitioner, listen, I'm going to do what they want.
Right.
I'm not going to judge their decision. Also, I know if someone's unwilling to let something go, they have a very good reason for that. There's a whole construct and belief system around that. So what we would do is undo the alcohol. Now, what I've seen numerous times is over time, when one coping skill is removed, but healthier things are put in, not just healthy coping mechanisms, belief systems, right? We're not switching coping mechanisms because this is also rampant in addiction. Is you go in addicted to something and you come out addicted to another thing, right?
You're just moving it.
You're just
shifting
moving things. You're moving the addiction, right? So in this circumstance, my goal is to put them back into connection. Remember, from that quote, the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety, it's connection. So we want to reconnect them with themselves, reconnect them with positive things, with worth, with value, and all of these things. Generally, over time, that if they, let's say I've got the client who comes in and they completely stop with the alcohol, right? They can't even imagine picking it up. That seems disgusting to them, but they're still going to smoke. Then over time, generally, I will see those people again and they'll be like, okay, now I'm ready to do the smoking, right? And maybe
because
not.
You started to unlayer some things. You started to surface, and even though they wanted to hold on to something that wasn't quote unquote harming them or people around them, they recognized, wait a second, I'm worth more than this.
Right, because just like hurt and pain and shame can tend to grow, so can healing. And the more that someone starts to see their worth and their value, and they start to actually, because remember, everything's the reticular activating system, our confirmation bias. When we start to shift one of those areas and we start to see that, oh my goodness, people do actually appreciate me, love me, I can connect, there's intimacy within myself, and I can share that with other people, then oftentimes these things that we're doing that are harmful to our body, I think everyone can agree, smoking is harmful to your body. It's harmful to your body. And over time, that will feel incongruent. So the secondary gains that they get from smoking become now they become incongruent with what you really say you want. And now they're willing to deal with the smoking. And so, but yeah, listen, addiction is a powerful thing. It's a powerful coping mechanism. And so our goal is not to shift to another addiction. It's to eradicate the root of addiction in the first place so that you can reconnect with yourself. Now, that being said, each particular addiction comes with its own set of triggers, if you will. And so it's one of the things through working with someone through addiction is that you've got to unlink a lot of the things that they linked. So a lot of people so for smokers, a lot of the time it's the oral fixation of it. Sometimes it's the sound of the lighter. They link things. So just like if you're like, wait, what? That's crazy. No, how about when you smell gingerbread or cookies and it takes you right back to grandma, or right, you hear this song and it takes you right back to like the windows down and the, air blowing through your hair when you're in high school. We link these things. So for people, when they found relief from, let's say, smoke, and then that feeling of calm comes over them, it's sometimes the things leading up to it that get the calm. So we have to undo all of that stuff, unlayer that stuff. It's not particularly difficult, but someone does have to be skilled into how to do that. So yeah, someone comes in, if they have multiple addictions, we're going to have to go through the behaviors that are linked to each one of those things.
And if someone comes in and they recognize that there's an issue, there's an addiction of sorts, and they don't want to let go of that for whatever reason, but they still want to grow and change and overcome things, then we can work around those things. And when they're ready to let go of the addiction, right? Because I've had clients like that, just like you have, or they come in and they realize, yeah, this is a problem. It's a problem to my parents. It's a problem to my family. It's a problem to my kids. It's a problem to, but I don't really feel it as a problem, right? They all think it is, but this isn't really what I want to work on. I want to work on this. Okay.
Well, you hear the psychology in that right there.
Right.
You hear what that's coming from. It's what they're looking for is they want total love and acceptance.
Unconditionality.
Unconditional. And they are putting this as a condition upon their love and acceptance.
And so until they recognize that I'm loved and accepted, even if, then they're going to hold on to that.
Right. And then they're giving that power out right now. They're giving it to the parents and they're giving it to the whomever. And they're saying well, I'm going to keep doing this and let's see if you love me. It's that testing thing that they're doing.
Right.
But we can get underneath of that. But the client has to be willing. They have to be willing, because it's unethical for us to go in and change things around that they don't want to be changed around, right? So I think that's something that can be difficult. The other thing is, if we dump judgment upon something, if they're coming in and they're like, so I still want to have the needle in my arm, but I don't want to smoke. It could be very easy for us to dump judgment on that, on something like an IV drug user versus the smoking, and for us to think, hey, really, this one's the worst thing. But for them, what I hear through that is they want help. They're looking, there's hope. There's a little bit of hope. And for them, if they can cut the cigarettes, that might be the step they need to cut the IV drug use.
And the way that Mind Change works is that even if you're just going in and you're changing things that have nothing to do, quote unquote, nothing to do with the addiction itself, because that's not why they're coming. The way that Mind Change works is you're working at something on such a deep neurological level that when you change one little thing, the trajectory of all the other spider web of changes that's going to happen, whether it's very quickly or whether it takes some time, it's still changing. That person is still evolving and becoming and overcoming and transforming.
You know where I see that happen a lot is in food addiction. is someone won't even recognize they have necessarily a food addiction and that they have a very unhealthy relationship with food. They may have some awareness of that, but that's not what they're coming in for. And we end up dealing with all these other things from their, their family of origin. And, we clean up a lot of that stuff. And then they come back and be like, I've lost 20 pounds without even trying. Because what they don't realize is we got after the food addiction because for them, they were trying to get that hit of love, that hit of comfort from the food that they now have because they resolved a lot of those other initial wounds and traumas, that they healed their relationship with food without even trying.
Which is why when someone comes into us for one thing, all of a sudden their relationship with their parents are better, their relationship with their spouse is better, or I randomly am sleeping better, or whatever it is, because everything is connected.
Yeah, those are the kind of side effects I like. Rather than like the drug side effects, you go in for this and you end up blind, or, like I go in for I have gastrointestinal issues. You take this pill and now I have headaches and migraines and I can't poop or whatever. Like we are used to side effects. What we're not used to is better side effects, good side effects. Like you come in for one thing and 5 things get better.
I know we did a mentoring call with our students on this at some point. Maybe we'll have to make it a podcast episode as well.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
That'd be fun.
What did we call that?
The side effects of mind change.
Oh yeah, the side effects of mind. Yeah, that's right. That's good stuff.
Well, is there anything else that you want to, information or anything you want to throw at our audience, just about addiction in general, addiction to addiction?
Yeah, I mean, just, hey, listen, if you're out there and you're someone or someone who's got extra funds, there is so much money going toward research of things that are still not working, proven models and thinking that don't work. And I would say, this works. Why don't thousands and thousands of people know about it? Because we don't have the money for the research and the exposure of that, because it puts the power back in the hands of the person. So there's not money to be made from it. So I think, that's one of the things that with our nonprofit, the Mind Change Movement, that we're seeking to get money and funding so that we can do the research, so that we can have some of the proof that this stuff works and that, people are eradicating addiction, not just the white knuckling it, like they're removing a compulsion to use. So many people walk out, they're like, I'm not an addict. I never was. I was coping. And, and then they go years without having any, not even a compulsion to do anything again. And they're so healed that they don't even remember how in depth that they were involved in that.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I would say, that's the kind of stuff that we need. These kind of things are never going to get huge and mainstream because there's no way to control. And, so it's going to be underground little things. It's going to be ways that, the right people hear about this and, you forward this episode to your friend who, forwards it to, and then people get well. And at some point we'll have enough people talking about it and we'll make some waves. But I think, yeah, there's hope.
And I know that your, maybe not so covert dream, right, is when we open at some point a retreat center, to be able to have a portion of that retreat center really be, in one sense, an intensive facility center where people don't have to come for 28 days and then go back in the streets and then be addicted again, where people, hey, come with us, be with us for a week and walk out just changed life forever, where it is not a 5% maybe stay sober for a little bit of time, right? But where it's like, no, people are just walking out of here transformed. They don't have to dump any more money into anything after that, right? That's kind of a little dream that you have, a big dream, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, speaking back to the little girl that I was with stars in my eyes, hoping that, grandpa would come out different, of this facility, or mom would come out different, or stepdad would come out different, or whatever. I think speaking back to that little girl of like, hey, there was hope. There is hope. And people can get help.
Yeah.
Like this isn't something that has to keep passing down from generation to generation. So for at least here, we can start really making change and breaking cycles.
And one of the things we talked about at the beginning was the thing that is desired in the addiction communities is community in and of itself, right? Because we value, we want that kind of community. But if it comes from a community of always struggling, always white knuckling, always an addict, there is going to be influence there versus joining a community of people who know, oh my goodness, there's real hope. Like a community of people who, oh, I've overcome too. And oh, you're there. I remember when I was there. You're not far from totally overcoming and transforming. And that kind of community is really what we're trying to build, because that's going to be a healed community rather than a trauma bonding community.
Yes, topic for another time. Well, thank you. I appreciate the interview style here and for your partnership in all of this as well.
Yeah, thanks for teaching us, helping us, and inspiring us.
And thank all of you for joining us on another episode of the Mind Change Podcast. I want to remind you that for those of you who feel inspired by this, who want to go deeper and learn more, we have online courses that really deep dive into all of the mind, body, and the science that go into the methods that we use. There's also a great support community that Kent referred to. We do mentoring calls with our students. The student community really is such an incredible place to be. And so if you are interested in that, take a look on our website, www.mindchange.com, and look at our online courses. With the courses come 2 sessions with a trained mind change practitioner. So it's a way to kind of jumpstart your journey if you're interested. But thanks again for joining us on the Mind Change Podcast as we endeavor to change the world one mind at a time.